بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين ألف لام ميم.
إلهي عظم البلاء وبرح الخفاء وانكشف الغطاء وانقطع الرجاء أضاقت الأرض ومنعت السماء وأنت المستعان وإليك المشتكى وعليك المعول في الشدة والرخاء. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد أولي الأمر الذين فرضت علينا طاعتهم وعرفتنا بذلك منزلتهم ففرج عنا بحقهم فرجا عاجلا قريبا كلمح البصر أو هو أقرب. يا محمد يا علي يا علي يا محمد اكفياني فإنكما كافيان وانصراني فإنكما ناصران. يا مولانا يا صاحب الزمان الغوث 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 أدركني 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 الساعة 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 العجاب العجاب العجاب. يا أرحم الراحمين بحق محمد وآله الطاهرين.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والحمد حقه كما يستحقه حمدا كثيرا ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين الصادقين سيما بقية الله في الأرضين وحجته على الخلائق أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين. Respected viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The art of practical advice. A topic that one may think, what exactly is going to be discussed? With regards to this topic, what we are discussing is the way that a mu'min or a mu'mina should carry themselves as a person, the way that their conduct should be displayed, the way they should dress, the way they should act in all different types of situations, and most importantly, the conduct of giving advice. So how is one to give advice to another person? Is one supposed to fluke advice? Are they supposed to base it on their soul experience or experiences? Or should one relate back to Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam and the wise personalities that the Holy Quran has discussed examples of? Today we have with us our guest speaker, Sayyid Mahdi al-Mudarris. Sayyid, Assalamu alaikum.
Alaykum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Hajj Ali.
Sayyid, good to see you. It's been a while that we haven't had you on the show, so welcome back.
Great to be back. Thank you so much.
So viewers, inshallah, as per usual, we'll begin with a short intro and we'll get straight into it. Please do pay attention because the questions do get a bit technical, but it's very practical advice that we can relate to in our day-to-day lives, even so to the point where people don't look at you as someone that has an insignificant approach or examples when talking and whatnot. So inshallah, the way that you conduct yourself after today's episode will help a lot in regards to people and respecting you and whatnot. So inshallah, we'll begin with the introduction and we'll fire off from there.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajjil farajahum. Everybody will need advice at some point in their lives. If you are smart, then you will consult other people on matters that are of interest to you. And so, because we all need advice, that also means that at some point or another, we're going to be expected to provide advice to other people who come to us seeking guidance and knowledge or some kind of expertise that we may possess. This makes the acquisition of advice as well as the delivery and giving of advice a very, very important thing that society needs in order to function properly. But it also means that it's a huge responsibility. It means that there are a plethora of etiquettes and means with which this advice is sought and given. Hence the topic of today's program, in which we should be in a position to talk about those etiquettes and address a lot of the questions that will pop up regarding this specific topic.
Ahsan, Sayyid. Sayyid, so we begin with possibly one of the most important questions throughout tonight's questions. The first question is, what are some of the most important and almost repeated forms of advice by Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam and all the wise personalities mentioned throughout the Holy Quran, and why specifically these?
We need to understand that the purpose of sending prophets and messengers was the idea of guidance. And so if people are to be guided to the truth, to these ethereal realities, to what lies beyond the physical realm, the realities that we are often distracted from, the things that we don't think about despite the fact that they're so important. For example, death, the afterlife issues, unlike bills that we pay and the commute to work that we take and the school that we go to and so on and so forth, those are realities that are much more important, but they're not on a day-to-day basis, which is why we don't forget these things and that we're cognizant of these greater realities. You know, the time we're going to spend in eternity is by definition much, much longer than the time we spend in this, station that's life, right? We spend, 70, 60, 80, 90 years, right? The Holy Prophet is quoted to have said, أكثر أعمار أمتي ما بين الستين والسبعين. The majority, the lifespan of the majority of my followers, my nation, is between 60 and 70 years, which is amazing. I mean, this was said 14 centuries ago, and the reality is that these are the kinds of lifespans that we're dealing with now. And so it's a very, very short, if you like, flash in the midst of this endless linear timeline. So the prophets come, they remind us that we're going to die, that after death there is another life, and that life is eternal, and that there's going to be repercussions for the actions that we performed in this life. That is basically the message of all prophets condensed in a few words, right? They're trying to remind us that God exists, that He's watching over us, that He is aware of our actions, that there is accountability for our actions, right? So of course the prophets are going to talk about, how to satisfy Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how to ensure that you don't anger God. Things like, and He says, فَوَاتَرَ إِلَيْهِمْ أَنْبِيَاءَهُ. God sent prophet after prophet. Why? لِيَسْتَأْدُوهُمْ مِيثَاقَ فِطْرَتِهِ. In order to revive that innate familiarity that we have with God, the promise, the covenant that we made with God in previous lives. This is now being fulfilled. This is now being taken. And لِيَسْتَأْدُوهُمْ مِيثَاقَ فِطْرَتِهِ وَلِيُذَكِّرُوهُمْ مَنْسِيَ نِعْمَتِهِ. It's also to remind us of the blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. It's easy to forget the blessings that we have. That's why even in this culture they say, count your blessings, right? We need to be reminded oftentimes by our therapist, right, that you have so much going for you. You have so much to be thankful for, right? Americans have Thanksgiving, and it's one feast a year where they sit down and they give thanks. We are reminded by prophets to be thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala day in and day out, in the morning, in the night. The prophet would wake up thanking God, he would go to sleep thanking God. So that's basically the message of the prophets.
So with regards, for example, to repetition, is it safe to say that all the forms of advice that they repeatedly kept mentioning was all advices in order to keep people close to God rather than away from God, such as stealing, drinking alcohol, lying, gambling, and all these sorts of things? So it was also always these types of advices that were given. Obviously, because we're not infallibles end of the day. So obviously, if it's safe to say again, Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, they give guidance to us in the sense of don't do this and don't do that. But at the same time, they're not going to give us advice to the point at their level, because it's like they're infallible, we're not. So obviously with us, it's a given that we're going to commit sin, we're going to do minor wrongs and whatnot. But obviously the major things, which are things that aren't so difficult to stay away from, such as it's easy not to steal, it's easy not to lie, it's easy not to drink alcohol and whatnot. So these sorts of advices, were these the most important sorts of things, or was it more about, the hereafter, the hereafter, the hereafter?
That's a very good question. I think broadly speaking, the afterlife was the singular focus of the prophets and the imams. If you read through Nahjul Balagha, for example, something that sadly many Shia never get to do because they're too distracted with playing video games or watching their favorite soap operas or whatnot. But if you read through those sermons, even if you take a select number of sermons from the imams, say Ash-Shaqshaqiyya from the Commander of the Faithful, to Al-Fadakiyya by Fatima al-Zahra, to Lady Zainab's sermon in Kufa or Sham, Imam Zayn al-Abidin's sermon, for example, if you take those, you'll find this consistent theme running through all of these sermons. And it's always the fact that these sermons begin with remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and reminding people that, look, this life is temporary, there's another life to come. Because again, that was the core of their message. That being said, it doesn't mean that they didn't go into detail. They didn't give advice on specific scenarios and things that people would go through on a normal in a normal day. So I think it's a misconception that the fact that we are sinners is a given, and therefore when the Imam spoke, they often spoke with in a very gentle tone. The reason I say it's a misconception is because we are capable of refraining from sin. In fact, if you look at the lives of some of the companions of the Imams, some of our scholars, if you examine and study their lives, you'll find that there are those who wouldn't even consider the idea of committing a sin. People like Sayyid ibn Tawus, for example, who says to his son in his will, he says to him that since I became mature enough to have religious rules apply to me, meaning reach the level of bulugh, I have not committed a single mubah, meaning a neutral act. In other words, everything I've done was always either wajib or mustahab. So is it possible for us to live a life of purity? I wouldn't call it infallibility, because that entails a whole other level of gnosis, but purity, where we actually follow the example set by the Ahlul Bayt, never really reaching their position, obviously, but avoiding that which is detrimental to our souls. It is possible. However, to go back to your question, the Imams spoke to people. They were, realistic in that people are different in terms of where they are in their journey. So you have someone who's got the right intention, someone who wants to genuinely be a good man or woman. But of course, because they happen to be sophomores in that class, because they happen to be, at the earlier stages of this journey, then the possibility of them tripping over and falling down is very real and possible. So the Imams would speak to them as though you would speak to a child. Imagine, and this of course goes back to the very theme of this show. Imagine you're trying to teach your kid how to ride the bicycle. If they're riding it for the first time, you will not be harsh in any way, shape, or form. Obviously, you wouldn't be harsh at all because you're trying to teach them something that's nice and beneficial.
Advice, as one may give advice to an individual to abstain from something that they are, for example, stuck in themselves.
That's a very good question. And in order to address that question, I will try and quote some of the ahadith of the commander of the faithful, Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, from this book, if anybody's interested. The book is called Mu'jam Hikam al-Imam Ali alayhi salam, which contains 32,000 actual maxims and quotes from the commander of the faithful, salawatullahi alayhi. It's an incredible book, over 1,100 pages or so, filled with maxims of the Imam. There's an entire chapter dedicated to this topic, and it's called An-Nasiha. And before I quote some of these ahadith, I'm going to give you a definition for the word nasiha, which will answer many of your questions. So in English we say advice. If you were to try to translate that into Arabic, you would say nasiha, but these two words are not, they're synonymous, they're just not exact verbatim translations of each other. Why I say that? You see, if I gave you financial advice or medical advice, let's say I was a doctor, I'd give you medical advice, that's what I do for a living. That's advice. Nasiha is different. Nasiha is to truly and genuinely care about the well-being of the person you're giving advice to. Now that has massive repercussions and ramifications on the entire discussion.
Yep.
Because if you truly cared for them, you would address them in a specific manner. You would escalate the issue if they didn't heed your advice. You would escalate it in a specific manner. You would give advice where you otherwise probably wouldn't if you didn't really care about them that much. You would refrain from putting too much pressure on them, as opposed to if you didn't really care about them that much. The point is that if you truly care about someone, as a father would towards their children, the manner with which they give advice is going to be very, very different than a random stranger giving random advice to random people on TV. So, for example, in Ziyarat Abil Fadl al-Abbas, Ruhi Fidah, we say the following: وَأَشْهَدُ أَنَّكَ بَذَلْتَ غَايَةَ الْمَجْهُودِ. Then we say, which basically translates as, I bear witness that you exhausted all your energy in defense of Imam al-Hussein. You left no stone unturned. Then we say, وَأَشْهَدُ أَنَّكَ, let me see if I can find the actual quote, قَدْ بَالَغْتَ فِي النَّصِيحَةِ وَأَعْطَيْتَ غَايَةَ الْمَجْهُودِ. So it starts off by saying that I bear witness that you offered the highest grade of nasiha, which means advice. He advised Imam Hussein. He advised who exactly? That's not what we're talking about. It's not about advice. It's about genuine, authentic compassion towards the other. In other words, if I, again, let's take the example of a father-son scenario.
Yeah.
A father genuinely cares about their son's well-being and welfare. So what they will do is, if they saw their children acting up, they're just being silly, the way they would advise them doesn't try to taint their character. Like, you're not trying to hurt them. You're trying to genuinely guide them. And so the way you speak to them at first is going to be very gentle. It's going to be loving and caring. They'll feel the care and love that you have being expressed towards them. And if they did something truly detrimental, really, really bad, let's say, for example, you caught them stealing or committing a really terrible crime, or, I don't know, going around and cursing people's women and whatever. If you saw them do that, like if the neighbor's kid did that and you weren't a direct victim of it, you probably care, maybe not, I don't know, depends on the situation. But if your son did it, you would stop them at any cost. There's a beautiful prophetic hadith, I believe, where the Prophet says, "Unsur akhak zaliman wa mazluma." A lot of people have taken that portion of the hadith, but not the rest. I've actually seen people use this. They say you have to defend your brother whether he's oppressed or he is the oppressor. You stand by him no matter what, which is a very tribal thing to do, a very Arab thing, if you like. So I don't care if my cousin was wrong. I stand with him because he's my cousin. In fact, in Iraq they have this saying where they say, "Ana wa bin ammi al gharib." I will stand by my cousin against the stranger, irrespective of whether the cousin is on the right or on the wrong, whether he's doing the right thing or the wrong thing. The Prophet says, "Unsur akhak zaliman wa mazluma." Then he says, they ask him, how do we stand by your brother if he's the oppressor? The Prophet says, if he's oppressed, you stand with him against the oppressor. If he is the oppressor, you ensure that you prevent him from oppression. You don't let him do that because it's bad for him, because you care for him. So you stand by him, but not in the sense that you would support him no matter what. Like some people say, "Oh, you're our daughter, we support you no matter what. You're our son, we love you no matter what. No matter what you do, we still love you." Are you kidding me? If they do something that's immoral, you don't support them no matter what. You stop them. That shows that you care about them. If you support them in their immorality, how is that support? It's like someone trying to stab themselves in the chest and you help keep stabbing them. I mean, it's a stupid thing to do. My point is, if we consider, and I'm sorry I took a little longer on this question, but I thought it was important to clarify that if we consider that the meaning of nasiha and genuine, sincere advice is to actually care about the well-being of the other person, this changes everything.
Do you want to give a couple of notes?
Yeah, sure. So I'll read some of these ahadith. For example, the Imam says, "An-nushu yuthmiru al-mahabba." To care about someone to the extent where you go out of your way to give them advice, right? This ultimately, in the long run, creates love and bonding between the two. Again, the Imam says, he rephrases, "An-nasihatu tuthmiru al-wud." Basically the same thing. "An-nasihatu min akhlaq al-kiram." To give nasiha is a sign of the noble ones. In other words, only the best of the best do this, right? "Al-mu'minu gharizatuhu an-nush wa sajiyatuhu al-kadhim." A believer, the Imam says, has an intrinsic proclivity towards love and compassion towards the other. غَرِيزَتُهُ, it's intrinsic to them. It's part of their personality, if you like, to actually care about other people. And if you care about them, then you'll give them sincere advice. وَسَجِيَّتُهُ الْكَظْمِ, and it's also part of his morals to prevent an outpour of anger. كَظْمُ الْغَيْظِ, that is. Anyway, inshallah we'll mention some more as we go along.
Said, we see many forms of different advice. Example, some advice like that of the Holy Prophet ﷺ at Ghadir Qum began with questions, allowing people to question themselves before the advice was given. Why was such an action done and the advice was not just given directly?
First of all, the Prophet ﷺ himself is quoted to have said, "Inna ma'ashara al-anbiya," we, the nation of prophets, أمرنا أن نخاطب الناس أو أن نكلم الناس على قدر عقولهم. The intellectual capacity of a prophet compared to that of, let's say, mine is, I mean, it's a bad example because it's an understatement, but imagine if you were comparing the universe with a grain of sand. So where the prophet is in his quote-unquote spiritual journey is at the very top of the pyramid, and I'm right there at the very bottom. And so ultimately, if you had someone who has so much knowledge and wisdom, let's say, for example, as a wise father, you see your son acting up in a really silly manner. I mean, we're talking about like your 2-year-old, for example, taking their clothes off in public. As someone who is like knowledgeable and mature and wise, you look at that and you're like, what's going on? Like, why would you do that? You know what I mean? It's an insult to your intelligence. And yet, you're able to suppress any, emotional outpour and to come down to their level and see things from their perspective and speak to them in a manner that makes them see the hideous nature of their act as it really is. So the prophets, the imams, alayhimus salam, God's apostles, were people who, the Prophet himself says that we are taught by God to speak to people in their own intellectual levels. So what that means is the Prophet could very well come out and say, A, B, C, D, this, that, and the other, this is the rule, this is the book, this is the law, no questions asked. However, the Prophet was more than anybody else so compassionate, so merciful, so loving, that he suppressed his anger when he was dealing with ignorance. You see, there's a difference. There's a time when you come across someone who's genuinely ignorant, and ignorant meaning doesn't have knowledge, hasn't been exposed to the truth, and so all they see is this, darkness. So what you want to do is light a candle. You want to show them the light. You want to show them that, hey, this is the way. You're going about your life in the wrong way. This is the right way. But then you come across someone who's like a real deviant, someone who's evil, demonic, right? And there are many examples of that in the lives of the Imams alayhim salam. They dealt with them in a different way. As for the Prophet in Ghadir Qum and other places, the Prophet is trying to remind them of his authority. He's trying to fulfill God's proof, as we call itmamul hujjah, right? The Prophet is trying to say, hey, do I not have authority over you? Did God not send me as someone who is your guardian, and therefore everything I say is, you're bound to it? You have to follow it. It's the gospel truth, so to speak. It's divine revelation. So he keeps asking these questions once again to remind them of his position, of his authority, of where he stands, of the fact that whatever he says, it's like the other day someone sent me a message saying, Sayyid, could you prove this concept from religious scriptures? So I shared a hadith with her. Then she goes to me, but what about the Quran? I said, there is no need for this to be proven using a clear, unambiguous Quranic verse. I said, the Prophet's words are just as authoritative as the Quran. مَا آتَاكُمُ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوهُ. The Quran itself says, whatever the Prophet says, you have to follow it. So ultimately, the Prophet is trying to remind them that, hey, do I not have authority? Am I not your guardian? So he's trying to ease their way into accepting and submitting to what he's about to say to them, which was very difficult for them to accept, right? Which is why over and over again, the hypocrites would say to the Prophet, is it just because he's your cousin? Right? You're trying to cozy up to your cousin because he's related to you, because he's your son-in-law. They always use this tactic of trying to undermine the Prophet's authority under the false pretext of nepotism and things like that. So the Prophet is trying to remind them, listen, am I not your ultimate authority, your highest guardian? If that's the case, then you have to follow what I tell you.
Ahsan Sayyid. On that note, for the fact of the blessings, what was the line that he said about Imam Ali alayhi salam, just to throw it out there?
قال ألست أولى بالمؤمنين من أنفسهم? Do I not have more authority over the believers than they have of themselves? قالوا اللهم بلى. They said, by God, yes you do. That's when the Prophet said, من كنت مولاه فعلي مولاه اللهم والي من والاه وعادي من عاداه وانصر من نصره واخذل من خذله.
Ahsan Sayyid. Ahsan Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Sayyid, we see that many holy personalities in the past were very strong in advice to either other holy personalities or non-holy personalities, such as Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam to Abu Dhar, or Luqman al-Hakim to his son, and even Nabi Musa alayhi salam to Fir'aun. What is the importance of advice to the point where you've got in the instance of Nabi Musa and Fir'aun, you've got one tyrant claiming that he's God and he's the go, and then you've got the Prophet of God advising him, don't do such and such, and follow the straight path, and there's only one Lord and whatnot. So with that being said, like, how important is advice? Because like we said earlier, a lot of people ask for advice, whether it be advice on marriage, advice on education, advice on even where to travel. In Islam, how important is the weight of advice to that extent where, like I said, you had an infallible telling a tyrant claiming that he's the real deal not to do something? Like, in other words, why would Nabi Musa care about Fir'aun when it's kind of like he's already sold his soul to the devil, in other words?
Right, good question. Okay, so when it comes to, broadly speaking, advice and nasiha is part of the process with which we develop. I mean, there's a place for books, there's a place for general lectures and sermons and whatnot, but then there's this deep inherent need within all of us for specific, individualized, bespoke, if you like, advice that's directed at us. It makes a big difference. Sometimes you come across these youth, and I'm sure you've seen people like that in your time. A youth who's got everything going for them, and yet they're deviant. They happen to find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time, among the wrong group of friends, right? And it's like all they need is somebody to come along and say, hey, look, what are you doing? This isn't you. You're better than this. You know what I mean? And we often, theoretically speaking, we can be excused for not appreciating the value of these few words, but it goes a long way. And we see how throughout history, examples of even in our own lives, right? Sometimes you have a brother or a close friend or a family member who tells you, hey, you shouldn't be doing this. And suddenly it kind of hits you like a rock. It makes you think, because whether it's our internal correction mechanism that's been dimmed out and switched off completely, or because we're just too distracted by the distractions of this life, or whatever it is, when somebody actually comes up to you and shows that they genuinely care for you, right then, they've already, they've got their foot through the door. They've opened this door to your heart. And now they come across as being genuine and sincere and authentic, and they tell you, hey, you shouldn't do this. You're better than this. it makes you think. And more often than not, it actually deters so much evil. So, as far as prophets speaking to tyrants, Musa to Fir'aun, Ibrahim to Namrud, our holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to the biggest tyrants. Traditions even tell us that the tyrants at the time of the Prophet were way worse than any Fir'aun, any Namrud, any of those despots could ever be. I mean, we're talking about people like Abu Jahl, and we're talking about Abu Lahab, and we're talking about Abu Sufyan, and we're talking about, Muawiyah, and people who carried this venomous scorn for generations against the Prophet. So that tells you how evil they were. And yet the Prophet would give them advice. So much so, in fact, again, this factors into the whole theme of compassion and genuine care. The Quran tells the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this may shock a lot of our viewers, the Quran tells our messenger on multiple occasions, are you trying to kill yourself over them? Imagine it has to come to the point where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to His Prophet, enough, leave them. These people aren't going to, they're not going to follow you. They're not going to do the right thing because they're that evil. But it tells you how much the Prophet cared. And again, if Fir'aun cares enough to give advice, if Musa cares enough to give advice to Fir'aun, then shouldn't we care enough to give advice to other people around us? I remember once we were with a group of people who came from different Western countries, and we visited Grand Ayatollah Mudarrisi in Karbala, and he said something which kind of stuck with me. He goes, listen, you're going to go back to your countries, you're going to go back to Canada, the US, Australia, whatever, and your neighbor, don't you care about them? Don't you love them? Someone you've been a neighbor with for like 20, 30 years, if you care about them, then you should convey the message of Islam to them. Because if you care about, let's say for example, God forbid their house was on fire, wouldn't you try to put it out? Of course you would. Now imagine, do you want to see them on fire on the Day of Judgment? If you don't, then share the good news with them, as they say. Share the message of the Prophet and the Quran.
Ahsan Sayyid. Alright, very important question. As Muslims, how important is one's conduct, and why should one pay so much attention to the way that they carry themselves?
I mean, I can't overemphasize how important that is. There's one hadith, in fact, that says that you should be pious enough not to exhibit one side of you while concealing a completely different dark side of yourself. In other words, this idea of cleansing ourselves of hypocrisy. We all have our outer appearance, and obviously we differ in shapes and sizes and colors and languages and accents and whatnot. But then there is another inner appearance that is, I guess you could describe it as the way our morals and our conduct are shaped. And so oftentimes you find people who are really presentable, really good looking on the outside. But in reality, if you were able to see what they looked like on the inside, they would be absolutely hideous, right? And I'm not saying you should judge others. Maybe we should start with ourselves. Like, this is how I look. This is how much time and effort I put into looking so good and presentable and nice and beautiful and whatnot. This is how much time I spend on putting makeup every time I wake up in the morning, right? And about the same time cleansing all the makeup when I go back to bed in my bedtime routine. This is me on the outside, but what am I like on the inside? You could see like a young guy, really strong, ripped, tight, goes to the gym, works out, whatever. But then when it comes to the smallest desire, he is as weak as a baby. They lose it. When it comes to greed, when it comes to envy, when it comes to arrogance, when it comes to all these things, suddenly they're so ugly and hideous and grotesque. So the key here is trying to create an inner look that is in unison with the outer look. Or at least spend as much time looking good on the inside as we do looking good on the outside. So, is it important? Absolutely. because that is the real us. At the end of the day, this flesh is all going to turn into dust. All this beauty, all this time, all these, beauty products that we invest in throughout our lives, they're all going to go and literally turn into dust and dirt in the grave. What's going to remain is the real me, right? The way we really look like, which is how we're going to look on the day of judgment, which is why we have a hadith that certain people will be raised as pigs on the day of judgment.
Wow.
Others will be raised as dogs. They'll be raised as bears. They'll be raised as this, that, and the other. Because that's how they look like on the inside, despite all the appearances.
With regards to that, say, I think a nice point to mention, it's something that you hear quite often, but they say, obviously without people misunderstanding what I'm about to say, with the factors that obviously do take an important stance, but they say, for example, when you get married, as the religion says, marry someone for their personality and their akhlaq and religion, because these things don't change in a person with age and time. It's something that's always sturdy. Whereas looks, you get married, you're young, you're solid, your skin's tight and all this stuff, and before you know it, you start getting wrinkly and you start, aging to the point where it's like, they've even got these comparison apps. It's like, what do I look as an old person? And then you've got the older people trying to look like what they look like when they were young to see if it matches up. And the funny thing is, they don't have like a personality, akhlaq, religion test. Right. It's always like a looks test, you know what I mean? So, obviously with that being said, obviously is very important.
If there was an akhlaq measurement app, I guess not many people would be able to use it because, it's all over the place. It would be a horror show, in my case anyway.
Ahsan Sayyid. Sayyid, moving on, I think we got about 20 minutes to go, inshallah, at most. Let's give a few hypothetical situations and how Islamically one should react according to past examples. A. So we'll go through, there's A, B, C. We'll go through each one, say a couple of minutes each. Mm-hmm. A. Someone decides to swear at your mother. So something common these days, especially amongst Arabs, for example, it's something that's as loosely said as however loose, something can be. Someone decides to swear at your mother. How is one to respond?
I think one of the, let's just look at this from a juristic perspective, first of all. Set morality aside.
Yeah.
You're right. Unfortunately, this is a bit of a trend in some cultures, in some countries. It's absolutely disgusting. Because one of the problems with that is oftentimes because cursing one's mother entails some kind of, indecent act, being the mother being accused of it, right? Islamically speaking, religiously speaking, this is a punishable crime, right? Because you're accusing the person's mother, who literally has nothing to do with whatever you're fighting over, of committing an act of sexual indecency. In fact, this is so despised in Islam that there is a hadith where I believe it was Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam, if I'm not mistaken, or one of the Imams, and the hadith says that he was walking with one of his companions that he had spent a very long time with. Like, imagine a really close friend of yours, someone you've been with for like 30 years. So that person had a slave who was Zoroastrian. And Zoroastrians, in some parts of Iran, and that's where they're focused, they have no problems with sibling marriages, so incest essentially.
Wow.
So the friend, the companion, curses the slave, and he says to him, Yabn al-Fa'ila. He curses his mother. He says, "O son of the fornicating woman." The hadith says the Imam became so visibly angry and enraged with him. He said to him, "How dare you speak with him like that?" So in an attempt to justify what he did, he says to the Imam, his mother is a Zoroastrian, so she's married to her brother, right? So kind of explains it, right? The Imam said to him, لِكُلِّ قَوْمٍ نِكَاحٍ. Every nation, meaning every religion and culture, they have their own marriage customs. In other words, their marriages, which if practiced in Islam would be haram to the power of 6,000, because it is acceptable in their culture, we recognize it. I mean, just think about that for a moment. The Imam said to him, you have no right to curse his mother. So how do you react to something like that? I mean, look, in our traditions, we have the famous story of Imam al-Baqir alayhi salatu wassalam, where this Shami comes up to him and he says to him, he starts to curse the Imam. Instead of calling him Baqir, he calls him Baqar, right? You're a cow. The Imam said, my mother called me Baqir. She didn't, I mean, look at the level of anger management and suppression that the Imams had. It was legendary, everybody knows that. The Imam says to him, but my mother called me Baqir. As if, to correct a typo.
Yeah.
Then the guy went to the next level where he started to curse the Imam's mother. And he said that your mother was a cook, meaning she was of the lowest class, the lowest caste. The Imam said, Tilka mihnatuha, that's what she did for a living. So like the Imam is using any available means to diffuse the situation. Then he went a step further. He said to him, Anta ibnul badhi'ah, you are the son of the foul-mouthed woman. At this point, because it's an accusation against the mother of the Imam said to him, if you are telling the truth, then may Allah forgive my mother. And if you are telling a falsehood, then may Allah forgive you. I mean, it's just on a whole other level, honestly. Every step of the way. So what do you do? How do you react? Number one, remember that cursing the guy's mother, just because he cursed my mother, is in itself haram. I have no right to do that. And number two, the best thing to do is to follow the example of the Ahlul Bayt. How do you think, despite centuries of persecution and murder and death and imprisonment and so on and so forth, this faith continues to thrive to this day? How do you think this religion continues to grow and expand and gain more and more followers, despite the fact that we, the followers, are all over the place in terms of our own conduct, in terms of how we promote it, in terms of how we apply it? I mean, we're the worst followers, but the religion itself is the most beautiful religion. And it thrived because of these examples of the Imams showing impeccable akhlaq.
Ahsan Sayyid. Sayyid B, while in the middle of a disagreement, the other person spits in your face. How do you react?
Wow. I mean, look, I don't think I've ever been in that situation. I've been in situations where I've been insulted and cursed and whatnot, but it takes another level of personality to suppress your anger and not to react in a similar fashion. But again, the beauty of our religion is that we have examples like that in our faith, right? Amirul Mu'mineen, famous story of the commander of the faithful, and Amr ibn Wadd al-Amiri in this pivotal battle which secured the victory for Islam and once and for all allowed Islam to survive when it was at the brink of complete destruction. Ali ibn Abi Talib is right there and Amr ibn Wadd spits in his face. How does the Imam respond? He practices the art of anger management and suppression, which, by the way, is a whole other show that we should have at some point if you haven't had it already, where the Imams, for example, tell us that one hadith says that anger, it stems from fire. So when someone is angry, get them to perform ablution and wudu, because you literally put water on fire.
Turning off the fire,
and it turns it off, right? Another hadith says that if somebody is angry, recite the adhan in their ear. Because what do you say in the adhan, essentially? You remind them that Allahu Akbar. No matter what it is you're going through, no matter how tough the situation is, God is greater. God can avenge whatever wrongdoing that's been directed toward you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is great. Remember God. Remember what's really important. So the Imam gets up and simply takes a few spins and walks around. Right? Which is something like, there was a person that I knew, may Allah bless his soul, he passed away. He used to have quarrels with his wife, and every time that happened, we knew because he would get out of the house, the apartment, and he would start to water the plants. And that was his way to manage his anger. And it worked like a charm. Beautiful. But my point is, something like that happens to you, just remember, It happened to someone much greater than you. It happened to God's vicegerent on earth, to Amir al-Mu'mineen, al-Qur'an al-Natiq, and he suppressed his anger.
Ahsan, Sayyid. Sayyid, and see the final one for that question. While being angry, you decide to immediately take revenge on your opponent.
Look, somebody once came to the Prophet ﷺ and he said to him, Ya Rasulullah, a'udhni. Give me advice. Wa'adh is usually, it's the kind of advice that is really long-term and more abstract. As in, it could be unsolicited. It doesn't have to be specifically about, a current issue. A'udhni ya Rasulullah, give me some guidance for life. Now, you'd think the Prophet would tell him, worship God, look after your mother, things like that. The Prophet said to him, La taghdab. Don't get angry. Then he says to the Prophet, okay, what else? The Prophet said, La taghdab. Don't get angry. What else, Ya Rasulullah? For the third time, the Prophet said, don't get angry. And if you think about it, many of the problems that we experience in our lives, many of the marital disputes that end up in divorce and much heartache and pain and misery. Like imagine, many of the issues that we have between siblings, between parents and children, between colleagues and partners and whatnot, they all stem from anger. In other words, if you were the kind of person who was like a punching bag, sometimes people use that in a negative connotation, I'm the punching bag of the family. So what? Be the punching bag. I'm not saying that the other side that oppresses you and hurts you is doing the right thing. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be stopped. I'm not saying that they're not committing an evil act. I'm just saying from your perspective, how do you react? How are you supposed to respond to all of this abuse, so to speak, right? You pretend like they don't know any better. I'll give you an example. The other day, this person sent me a long message about how their mother has been oppressing them and abusing as in emotional abuse, right? Which is like a new thing now. Emotional abuse is grounds for divorce. This emotional abuse that I've been experiencing from my mother since I was a child. And the person is an adult now. And they were telling me like, you know what? The other day I just decided to muster up the courage and just walk away. So I left the family, I left my mother, I left my brothers and sisters, and I went and I'm independent. For the first time in my life, I'm happy. So I said to them, okay, let's spin this around. Let's say this wasn't your mother, but your own children. If your children were being emotionally abusive towards you, would you also just walk away? Would you abandon them? Or would you stay no matter what and try and fix it? You would, wouldn't you? Because they're your kids. Like, how are you going to abandon them? If you abandon them, who's going to take them? But see, the difference between these two scenarios is just a mental switch. If it's my kids, I'll stay and fix it no matter what. But if it's my parents, if it's my husband, if it's my wife, then I couldn't care less. The first sign of trouble, and they run for the door. So if it's just a mental switch, it means that you have it in you to withstand all of this and to fix it, right? Or at least to be patient and see it through. You have it in you. You choose not to do that. So when it comes to anger, we all have it in us. As we've seen in the example of the Imams alayhim salam, how they were subjected to unspeakable abuse. Let's not even go there. Let's not even compare what they went through to what we go through from our own family and friends and our own brothers and sisters. Do we have it in us to actually be patient and not burst out and, as you described it in your scenario, to just unleash all of this anger in response to what they have done? Of course we have it in us. It's a process, however. It means you train yourself. Just like you train your body to pick up heavier weights, right? You train your soul, you train your mental reaction. And you constantly remind yourself, as Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas alayhi salatu wassalam, and other shuhada in Karbala did, this whole, what do they call it in English? There's a word for it, affirmations, right? These affirmations go a long way. يا نفس من بعد الحسين هوني وبعده ما كنت أو تكوني هذا حسين وارد المنون وتشربين بارد المعين. oh self, oh Abbas. We can all do this, right? When you wake up in the morning, you know that your husband's going to say something that's going to, ignite the fire. You know your father is going to say something, your mother's going to say something. Constantly remind yourself, Ya Mahdi, it's okay. Whatever they say, just ignore it. Just be nice. Just smile. We could use these affirmations to strengthen ourselves and eventually live a happy life.
Ahsan Sayyid.
Ahsanallah.
So Zaid, we only got a few minutes left, so I'll just choose one of the following questions.
I thought that was the last question.
No,
Sorry,
so there was
I
7,
went on
8,
and on.
9, but that's all right. What we'll do, we'll probably give the most relevant example question. Sorry. All right. With regards to conduct, how is one whom is in the trade or blue collar industry to deal with individuals? One of the most common instances is how to manage yourself during a handshake with the opposite gender, or escaping from that Christmas dinner where alcohol is present on the table. Besides the common ways of, the whole, oh, my hand is najas, sorry, I can't shake, I've got oil on my hands.
I've got leprosy.
What's the best way to go about this without kind of making people feel like,
Awkward.
It's like a hatred sort of thing. It's, I've heard lines before, people saying, oh, you Muslim men don't shake with us women because you think we're unclean. And a response has been given. It's like, it's not that you're unclean, it's the fact that I'm unclean and I don't want to make you dirty. But from an Islamic perspective, how do you go about these things?
It's still awkward. Like, no matter how you frame it, it's going to be super
It's something
weird.
that stresses you out. You're attending a work interview or something. You start thinking, Ya Rab, inshallah, it's not a lady, so that I might not get the job if I refuse the handshake. Or that Christmas party, it's like, they've got the turkey, they've got the alcohol and everything, and it's like, oh, we're having a Christmas party, and you're like a team leader. And it's like, if you're not there, you've ruined the vibe.
That's right.
And then it's kind of like, center of attention and just wine all over the table. And how do you conduct yourself in these situations?
A couple of points that I would share with you, and I totally sympathize with people who find themselves in that situation. Thank God, maybe because of the way I look, or where I am in different circumstances, I don't have to deal with that sort of stuff, but I totally feel for people who have to, face such circumstances and deal with them. A couple of things I'll mention here. Number one, the verse in the Quran says, وَمَنْ يَتَّقِ اللَّهِ يَجْعَلْ لَهُ مَخْرَجًا وَيَرْزُقْهُ مِنْ حَيْثُ لَا يَحْتَسِبُ. If you're pious, God will find a way out for you. You won't be stuck. You'll manage the situation somehow if you're being pious. And if you're trying to do the right thing, God will help you. So that's just, an overarching rule that you should always keep in mind. So don't ever commit an act of sin. Because I remember that, there was someone that I got to know, wasn't really a friend, but he once, I was friends with his brother. He came to pick us up from the airport, and he was extremely wealthy. And he says to me, he goes, sometimes we have these clients that come from different states and different countries, and you have to wine them and dine them, and you have to take care of them and look after them. And I'm like, why? Do you think like the only way you can sustain yourself and you can earn a living is through these acts of sin and transgression, to actually buy alcohol and serve it to these clients so that they'd be happy with you, or to go out and take them to the pub or the bar so that they would kind of become tipsy, and they say that's where all business deals are signed and whatnot, because everybody's like lost the plot and they all feel so much more real. And it's not just losing the plot, it's also they feel the sense of confidence, I guess. They feel comfortable with each other, and so they sign those deals. Like, ultimately, your sustenance is in God's hand, right? If you're trying to break His laws in order to make a quick buck, then you should know that you're not going to enjoy that, right? Whether it be in this world or the next, you're not going to enjoy it. That's one point. The other point is, I think the silver lining in the whole coronavirus situation is that the world post-COVID and pre-COVID are two very different worlds. Now, if you choose not to shake hands, I think people will be relieved if you say, I don't shake hands. But still, there are cases where that is a problem. In which case, I would say, we're not the first people to go through this. Hasidic ultra-Orthodox Jews also don't shake hands with the opposite gender. In fact, they don't even sit next to the opposite gender on a plane, right? There's been so many stories, you can Google this, where planes are grounded because this person says, I don't want to sit next to this woman, and the woman doesn't want to move because her husband's sitting next to her. And there's this whole situation where air marshals come in and whatnot because he wants to abide by the rules of his religion. So, in fact, a Jew once told me, he goes, my niece can't physically touch me. Because you know how we have the whole rules about mahram and non-mahram and whatnot? Apparently, according to the sect that she followed, she was not allowed to touch her uncle. And so, we're not the first people to go through this. Other people have as well. The difference between most of us and them is that we're too apologetic and too shy about to say these things. If you're a team leader who's worried about what's going to happen at the Christmas party, then you haven't shown them who you are. You should at some point draw some boundaries and explain that, hey, I'm a Muslim, which means I never go anywhere near alcohol. I don't shake hands with the opposite gender out of respect for them and out of respect for me and to keep those boundaries. And so you do that on the first day. You do that when you do the job interview. And once you've done it, that's it. You know, you're over that little plateau. That problem is no longer there because everybody recognizes you as the official office weirdo, and so it's never going to come up again. Yes, this would be an issue if you were like a salesperson or someone who meets new clients every day, right? At which point, I feel genuinely sorry for you. But even then, there was someone in the US who once goes, he goes, you know, I went into this office atmosphere and I shook hands with everybody except this one woman. Now that is awkward. Like if you say I don't want to shake hands with anybody, then that's fine. But to actually single out the woman, I think that's what they feel most insulted about. So he goes, I just told her, look, I'm sorry, it's my religion, I can't do it. So he didn't explain, sorry, he just said, I can't shake your hand. He said, after the meeting, she came up to me and she said, can I ask you why you chose not to shake my hand? And he says, I told her, look, I have this bond with my religion and my God. And the covenant, the bond that I have with my God says that I do not shake hands. It's like saying I've made a vow not to touch another woman. And so he goes, she respected me for that, right? I'll give you one last example and we'll wrap up with that, I guess. I have someone in my family. He says that once he was traveling to this country in, I think, a Scandinavian country. It was probably Iceland, right? So like a really weird country that I guess most people don't go to. And he says, when I came out of the hotel on the first day after I got settled in, he said, on the street, suddenly these two young women crossed the street to come to where I was. He goes, at first I freaked out because I thought they were going to rob me or something, right? But they didn't look like your average robbers. They were young, beautiful, women. Because they came up to me and they said, can we kiss you? And he says, I told them, I thought about it for a second. And he goes, I told them, no, you can't. And they were shocked. Like, why would you say no? They said, look, we've made this pact, or we're doing this competition or something between us. Who gets to kiss more strangers on the street?
Well,
so can we kiss you? He said, I told them, he goes, Allah, revealed this to me. It was like an intuition from God. He goes, I told them, I have a vow with my wife that no other woman gets to touch me, let alone kiss me. And he goes, they were like in so much awe, as in, oh wow, how honorable, how faithful, you know what I mean? So I guess when it comes to these situations, you can explain it in a manner that doesn't offend anybody. We're not trying to offend anybody, it's just a matter of it's our faith, it's our values, it's our religion. Explain it gently. There will be awkward circumstances, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will help you. وَمَنْ يَتَّقِ اللَّهِ يَجْعَلْ لَهُ مَخْرَجًا وَيَرْزُقْهُ مِنْ حَيْثُ لَا يَحْتَسِبُ.
Ahsan Sayyid.
أحسن الله إليك بارك الله.
Viewers, that's the episode for today. As you can see, before we started the show, I did mention that it would change your perspective on conduct and how to react in certain situations. And it is something that we all fall into, you know, whether you're in an argument with someone or whether you want to take immediate revenge if something has happened. I guess the core of the message here is that you always need to go back and think to yourself, if I'm a mu'min or a mu'mina in my day-to-day life through my actions, so that I don't hide inside me a different type of personality, react in the way that Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam would react. So someone tells you off, suck it up, and just constantly think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you'll get past that. And I believe there's a narration to wrap up that says, I think it's from Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, correct me if I'm wrong, he says that the person that is in a position to take revenge but doesn't is actually the stronger person. Because you're in a position to take revenge because it's your right, but you've held back for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore ultimately the reward is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, wa hadha akhiru da'wana. And viewers, thank you very much for watching. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
عليكم السلام ورحمة الله.
اللهم إنا نشكو إليك فقد نبينا صلواتك عليه وآله وغيبة ولينا وكثرة عدونا وقلة عددنا وشدة الفتن بنا وتظاهر الزمان علينا فصل على محمد وآله وعنا على ذلك بفتح منك تعجله وبضر تكشفه ونصر تعزه وسلطان حق تظهره ورحمة منك تجللنا وعافية منك تلبسنا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.